sponsored by Skillshare. Hi guys, it's Claire, welcome back. Today I am here to bring you part 2 of my January reading wrap-up, which is really just a hodgepodge of a few different things. In part 1 of my January reading wrap-up, I talked about the more literary fiction and nonfiction that I read in December and January, and so today I wanted to talk about the handful of romance novels that I've read recently, and then I also want to take some time to do some booktube shoutouts and talk about a few of the books that are on my February TBR as well. So without further ado, let's dive right in, starting with the romance novels. First up, I want to talk about 2 extremely popular contemporary romance novels that I finally picked up recently, and the first one is Beach Read by Emily Henry. Beach Read follows January Andrews, who is a very successful 29-year-old women's fiction / romance author whose father dies quite unexpectedly and who she then discovers had a secret mistress and a secret beach house that he has left to her. So January goes to spend the summer at this beach house to kind of work out her grief and her now very complicated feelings about her dad, and she also just needs a place to crash while she works on her latest book. And because this is a romance novel, January soon discovers that the beach house next to hers in this tiny little town in Michigan is occupied by none other than Augustus Everett, a best-selling literary fiction novelist who is also her arch nemesis from college. And they end up making a bet that each of them will try to write a novel in the other person's genre. So January will try to write a serious literary fiction novel, and Gus will try to write a feel-good rom-com. And in the process, over the course of the summer, they also might just fall in love. And this was a very cute read. It's one of those books that I found myself looking forward to picking up every morning. It's got some really good banter, and then some of the scenes between Gus and January were genuinely really romantic and sweet. However, it ultimately didn't end up leaving that much of an impression on me in the long run. I don't think that I've thought about these characters at all since I finished reading the book. And I think that's because although the dynamic between the two of them was really sweet and really fun to read about, individually as characters, Gus and January both fell kind of flat for me. They actually kind of reminded me of like CW characters, just in that they're both like good looking but bland, one note kind of people. And I think the reason that they're both so unmemorable is because Emily Henry does fall into that trap of using trauma as a kind of shortcut to character development or character depth. And so rather than feeling like real dynamic, complex people, Gus and January both feel kind of like the sum total of the worst things that have ever happened to them. And so they're less fully formed as individuals than they are these kind of representatives of 2 very different but very simplistic worldviews. So Gus, for example, has had this really hard, abusive upbringing, and as a result, he's this kind of brooding, cynical, nihilistic kind of guy. And January, in contrast, grew up in a very happy home, and so she's this very fun, cheerful, optimistic, romantic person, at least until her mother gets diagnosed with cancer, and then her father dies unexpectedly, at which point her entire belief system is kind of thrown out the window, and she doesn't even know who she is anymore or even what her personality is. And obviously, we are all affected and shaped by the various things that happen to us, but I also think that we are all a little bit more complicated than Gus and January are on the page. So I did enjoy reading this book, but I also think the reason that I thought it was just good and not great is because the characters ultimately didn't do a whole lot for me. And then the other super popular romance that I read last month was The Hating Game by Sally Thorne, which several people have recommended to me in the past. And this novel follows Lucy and Josh, who work at the same company and are each executive assistants for the 2 co-CEOs. So they hate each other, their desks are across from each other, and they basically spend all day, every day, verbally sparring with each other and or sexually harassing each other at work. And this was another book that I found myself like picking up at all hours of the day. It was compulsively readable, just like great banter, great chemistry between the two leads, great sexual tension, but much like Beach Read, it's also one of those books that has kind of instantly faded from my mind since I've put it down. I did find the characters of Josh and Lucy to be a lot more memorable and interesting than Gus and January, and as a whole, The Hating Game feels much more kind of lively and rom-com-y than Beach Read, which I think is more of a dramedy. But Sally Thorne did ultimately kind of lose me in about the last 20% of the book, where the whole story just devolves into like Josh's daddy issues, which I didn't really enjoy. And the other thing is that this book isn't self-published, but it sometimes reads like it's self-published, which was only really a problem when you kind of stumble across these occasional jokes that just read as very glib and thoughtless. Things like, oh, your apartment makes my apartment look like a Calcutta slum, or this incessant recurring fat shaming of Josh's boss. I don't know, it just felt very circa 2010 type humor, like trying to be funny by being edgy or mean-spirited in a way that just felt very outdated and kind of immature, and in a way that did take me out of the book a little bit. So yeah, this was another one that was ultimately good, not great, with a few caveats thrown in on top of that. And in case this wrap-up wasn't grumpy enough already, next up I read Romancing Mr. Bridgerton by Julia Quinn, which is the 4th book in the Bridgerton book series, and I hated it. I picked this one up because I started watching Bridgerton on Netflix along with 82 million other people apparently. And honestly, the only couple in that show that I gave 2 hoots about were Colin and Penelope. And so, spoiler alert if you're hypersensitive about any type of Bridgerton stuff, but I went and looked up all of the books in the Bridgerton series and read their synopses to try and figure out if like Colin and Penelope ended up together, as the show suggests that they will eventually, and as it turns out, they do. And so Romancing Mr. Bridgerton is their story. It takes place about 10 years after the first book in the series. At this point, Colin is 33, Penelope is a 28-year-old wallflower turned presumed spinster. Penelope has been in love with Colin for years. Colin has never really thought about Penelope that way, and he's also been out traveling and gallivanting and globetrotting like the rich bachelor that he is. But now that he's returned home to England, he's starting to feel more pressure to get married, and he's also starting to see Penelope in a slightly different light. And I really wanted to like this book. I love a wallflower, I love some tortured, years-long pining, but after reading this book, I really just don't think that historical romance is for me, and I particularly don't think that Regency romance is for me. I don't enjoy the kind of severe power imbalance that exists between the male and female characters in historical romance, and I also really don't enjoy how sex and marriage and reputation play into all of that in Regency romance, even though I know that it all is rooted in some degree of historical accuracy. And I can understand why for some people that's appealing, because it does kind of heighten the stakes of everything, and it can also be fun to see how people try to navigate and work out these different relationships and feelings within these rigid social constraints. But I don't know, just that looming threat of a woman potentially being ruined or compromised in a Regency romance just is not the kind of excitement or suspense that I want in a romance novel. And like, nothing takes the wind out of my sails like a couple hooking up in a carriage one time and then needing to get married because of it. Like, what a drag. It's just like not for me. What is for me, apparently, are gay hockey romances, which brings me to my favorite romance novel of the month, which was Heated Rivalry by Rachel Reid. This is the second book in her Game Changers series, and I saw Deboki over at Okie Dokie Boki talk about this book in her 2020 reading highlights and lowlights video, and I have yet to be disappointed by one of Deboki's romance recommendations, and so I picked this one up and just ended up being super, super charmed by it. Like I said, this is a gay hockey romance that follows two NHL players, Shane Hollander and Ilya Rozanov, who are the two top players in the league and who have also been famed rivals on the ice since their rookie season. Unbeknownst to the rest of the world, they have also been secretly hooking up since their rookie season. They usually meet up a handful of times every year when their teams are in town playing each other, and so it's only over the course of many, many years that they actually start to develop feelings for each other and start to fall in love. And this is a book about two closeted queer men. Shane is gay, Ilya is bi. So if you don't want to read that kind of gay romance, just a heads up that that's what this is, and that element of the story also isn't completely resolved by the end of the book. It's more of a kind of happy for now situation. That being said, I do think it's really, really sweet to watch the process of these guys start to realize that they care about each other, acknowledge that they care about each other, and eventually admit that they want to try to figure out a way to make it work. The stakes feel really real, and I don't know, this book just made me feel so soft, which is kind of hilarious because there is like so much sex in this book. It's insanely smutty, like right from the jump, to the point that it's almost too much just because it starts to feel kind of repetitive. But it also creates this interesting tension where you as the reader are like dying for these two to just like hold hands or like spend the night together after they've hooked up. And so it cleverly swaps out the usual sexual tension of a romance novel and replaces it with emotional tension and this overwhelming desire for these two people to just show each other any kind of tenderness or vulnerability. And then when they finally do, the emotional payoff of that is just so nice and satisfying as a reader. So yeah, this book was ultimately just really, really sweet. I wouldn't say it's amazingly written, but I do think that the characters are really fully formed and fully realized. I think Ilya in particular is a genuinely charming and hilarious character on the page, especially in the second half of the book. And yeah, I now just have this Shane and Ilya sized hole in my heart. So thanks to Deboki for that recommendation. Next up, I wanted to do some quick booktube shoutouts because I realized that I haven't done any formal shoutouts since like 2018. So I wanted to shout out some smaller booktubers who I've been watching recently, and then one kind of a long time favorite that I don't think I've ever formally shouted out before. So first up, I have CJ from CJ Reads. CJ started her channel last year and she posts a lot of kind of chatty, casual vlogs where she talks about what she's reading, what she picked up from Target recently, that kind of thing. And I just find her videos immensely watchable. I think she's really charming. She reads a lot of recent releases and literary fiction and just seems like good vibes all around. I also wanted to shout out Nicole Is Here to Learn, who I've been watching for a long time, and she reads a lot of literary books as well, with a focus on books in translation and more international global literature. She's one of the hosts of the Invisible Cities Project, which looks at works in translation from different countries around the world, and I just love her taste in books and the way that she talks about them. Then I have Erin from Erin's Library, who started a booktube channel and is also active on Instagram, also at Erin's Library. And she reads a lot of Indigenous books and authors, and she also reads quite a bit of genre fiction. And she's made some cool genre-themed reading videos about things like Indigenous historical fiction or Indigenous horror fiction, which I've really loved as someone who's trying to expand my genre horizons. She does post more frequently on Bookstagram than she does on BookTube, but I recommend following her on both platforms because I really do love her style of video. And then she also just posts great book reviews on Instagram as well. And last but not least, she's been on BookTube for several years, and I've already mentioned her once in this video, but I wanted to give a shout out to Deboki from Okie Dokie Boki, just because I've been a fan of her videos for a long time, and I just love the way that she talks about books, pop culture, and everything in between. She reads a lot of literary fiction. She also reads a lot of romance, as I mentioned, and then she also hosts a monthly nonfiction book club, often focused on something science related because she has that whole other half of her brain going on too. And yeah, I just love her brain and the way she thinks about things and the range of things that she chooses to talk about on her channel. Her discussion videos are always like an instant click for me, and so I highly recommend checking her out if you haven't already. And lastly, I wanted to mention a few of the books that I have on my February TBR because there are a couple of different cool read-alongs and readathons happening this month. The first one is the Black Lit Challenge hosted by Seiji over at the Artisan Geek. February is obviously Black History Month, and so Seiji has put this challenge together as a way to encourage people to read books by Black authors throughout the month. So I'll link Seiji's announcement video down below along with details about the challenge, but a couple of the books that I am hoping to read for it are The Fifth Season by N.K. Jemisin, which I have already started listening to on audiobook, and then I'd also like to try to read Girl, Woman, Other by Bernardine Evaristo this month because I've had that at the top of my TBR for several months now. I got a copy of it from a friend for my birthday, and then my roommate also recently read it and has been nagging me to read it so that we can talk about it. And then Alex over at What Page Are You On is also hosting a Ferrante February read-along this month, in which he will be reading and discussing one Elena Ferrante book each week. The week-by-week schedule is Troubling Love, followed by The Days of Abandonment, then The Lost Daughter, and finally Incidental Inventions. I have read all of these books except for Incidental Inventions, which is a published collection of the columns that Elena Ferrante wrote for The Guardian recently, and so I am going to try and read that this month because I think it's the only outstanding Elena Ferrante book that I haven't read yet. But if you are a Ferrante newbie, or if you haven't had a chance to explore some of her earlier shorter books outside of the Neapolitan Quartet, this is a great time to hop on board, and so I am going to link Alex's video down below so you can follow along with his reading and his discussions that he's going to be doing throughout the month. Before I head out, I also wanted to mention that this video is kindly sponsored by Skillshare, which is an online learning platform for curious and creative people looking to expand their skill sets and explore their passions, whether that be video editing, arts and crafts, baking, and much more. I've been doing some more watercoloring in quarantine. I actually have a watercolor Zoom hang that I'm doing later tonight with some friends. And so I took another one of Skillshare's beginner watercolor classes. This one was called Watercolor in the Woods, a beginner's guide to painting the natural world, taught by illustrator Rosie Hazlett. And in it, she goes over how to go out in the world and take reference photos for your painting, how to sketch out an initial image, and then mix and layer paints as you're watercoloring to get the right look. Like all Skillshare classes, this one had an interactive project. Skillshare classes are also designed to fit your busy schedule. It's less than $10 a month with an annual subscription, and it's specifically curated for learning, which means that there are no ads, and they're always launching and introducing new and exciting premium classes for you to explore. So if you're interested in exploring your creativity through Skillshare, the first 1,000 people to click on the link in the description box below will get a free trial of Skillshare Premium membership. Thanks again to Skillshare for sponsoring this video. Thanks to you, as always, for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye!